Hi, my name is Malcolm Clemens Young, and I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California, and welcome to our online forum. Our cathedral theme this year is the theme of bridges. We're talking about how to bridge distances between things people divide, and we're talking about how to make connections that we may never have imagined making before. So it was a pretty, this year has been a year of bridges for everybody because of COVID-19, but at Grace Cathedral, we've been focusing on this for about a year. The COVID-19 public health emergency is also causing a human rights crisis, with its economic and social effects disproportionately impacting the poor, the elderly, and people of color. Even if we are, quote unquote, all in this together, some enjoy more safety, shelter, resources, and care. How does moral thinking about the common good challenge these disparities? How do conceptions of the common good differ across national and cultural contexts? And how can religious communities and theological ethics teach us to address them? For this conversation about individualism and inequality and discerning a sense of the global common good in a time of crisis, I feel so blessed to have my friend Grace Kao as my guest this evening. Grace is professor of ethics at the Claremont School of Theology, co-director of the Center for Sexuality, Gender, and Religion, and the author of Grounding Human Rights in a Pluralistic World. So here is her book, Grounding Human Rights in a Pluralistic World. And it's a very, very dog-eared and very, I do a lot of, if you ever want to see my annotations, Grace, every page almost. Usually I don't write so much. But thank you very much for joining us tonight. We're so glad to have you. We really appreciate you making time for this, and I know a very busy life. So these last 4 months of COVID-19, how have they affected you? How do they, like from an ethicist perspective, what does the world look like? How does the world look different than it did maybe 5 months ago?
So first I should say thank you, Malcolm, for the invitation. And it's great. I don't think we've ever done anything like this for all the years that we've known one another.
Oh, it's funny. I've probably had 150 people on the forum or something. And, and so it is really fun to be, I've been looking forward to this so much.
Yes. Yeah. But to ask your question, so you wanted to know, how has it affected me personally, or has it affected the world?
Well, I'm interested in both because you and I had our last long conversation in November.
Sure.
And so I am kind of interested in how you're doing personally. But I totally have been thinking about just all the ethical questions about, when to reopen, Black Lives Matter, how racial disparities have had such a devastating and deadly effect. And so I do kind of think about, what from a professional ethicist perspective,
Sure.
What are we learning? Just so both would be good.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll start with the personal, since it's quick and easy. So like every other professor in the country and around the world, I had to quickly pivot my classes to teach them online. As a parent of school-age children, I also had to figure out how they were going to continue their schooling, right, remotely. So those are probably the two biggest major personal changes.
Yeah.
But as an ethicist, I could teach our concepts and our theories and our principles in real time as other professional ethicists, and as the world was grappling with all the things you just named, the public health crises, concerns about governments using the health crisis as a way to discriminate against already oppressed populations, health disparities, BLM, and now we're seeing protests. And then, of course, the two are linked, right? The concerns about racial injustice, and which, of course, are not new. It's right now we're just experiencing the latest iteration. And you see a link between the concerns there and, in this country, the demographics of persons who are dying and being infected at higher rates than the general population. So I am not a specialist, though, in bioethics. So while I have been called to do a number of sessions like this, I'm not like some of my colleagues who are on CNN and whatever, talking about how you ration ventilators when there's a shortage, that type of thing.
Right. It's funny because I wonder just though about just like how you strike a balance between these things. In your book, you even mentioned like a public health crisis may mean that you'll have effects on human rights, so it's really fresh in my mind that the freedom to move about, or the freedom to be in the public square, or the freedom to participate in public life, the freedom to be part of a government, the freedom to like religious freedoms, all of those, that's something that you bring up in the book, long before any of us imagined this. But how do you balance something between, say, reopening the economy versus public health concerns like protecting elderly or people with pre-existing conditions?
Yeah, good. So when we're talking about international human rights law, there's a distinction that's made between rights that can be restricted or curtailed under certain carefully circumscribed circumstances, and rights that cannot. So rights that cannot, non-derogable rights, are things like enslavement and torture. You technically can never enslave someone. You can technically never torture someone. Of course, that still happens, right?
Right.
But something like freedom of movement is not considered by international human rights standards a non-derogable right, meaning in the interest of public health, so long as governments are not doing so in a discriminatory manner. Now, of course, you can make distinctions, but they can't be arbitrary. So you can imagine a situation where, in the interest of public health, a directive states that if you've been in contact, with people who've tested positive, or if you've recently traveled from a hot zone area, you might be subject to quarantine. So that's obviously discriminatory, meaning you're treating one group of people different than another, but it's not done so in an arbitrary way. So the fact that you might only be able to achieve some human rights, health, by restricting others, freedom of association, freedom of movement, that's not a surprise, right? That's always been the case for all the human rights that we honor and want and respect and have signed on to. So I should say that. But you're right to push that. So the question is not whether it's okay to do it, but where exactly do you draw the line, right? How much is too much? And as someone who just follows the news like everyone else, you hear of quarantine in China happening differently than quarantine in Italy and quarantine in different states in the US, for example.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting because I say, like, there's elements of your book that just kind of foreshadow some things that are happening right now, and it does make me think about it. There have been times when you and I have sat down and you've outlined kind of like what your areas of scholarly interest are, and I wonder if, just like for the sake of our audience, they'd be interested in knowing kind of what your areas of expertise are.
Okay, so I think of my work as lying at the intersection of philosophy and theology. And I identify first and foremost as an ethicist, so a Christian and philosophical ethicist. I've done human rights theory. This is the book that you've read. And then there was a period of time where I was very interested in the role of religion in the public sphere in the US, especially the category of civil religion. So I did some work there. In the last 10 years or so, I would say I've developed two areas of interest that I didn't have when we first were classmates in grad school. So one is in feminism/ecofeminism. It's something that I developed, again, through the normal process of reading more and interacting with the world and students. And the second is on Asian American Christianity, Asian American Christian ethics. So I've always been Asian American. I just never integrated my identity with my scholarly pursuits, but it's something that I've been doing for the past 10 years.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You were the first Asian American woman tenured in your institution, and I wonder if you can talk just about that. And I know, even this Black Lives Matter timing, it seems like you have a lot to share with the world in terms of just your take on what's happening and how it looks from someone who's of Asian American background. Like, what's your family story and how's that influenced your scholarly work?
Yeah, thanks for that. So, Asian Americans are living at this is a unique moment for us in a number of ways. So anyone who's been following the news, you'll know that there's been an uptick in hate crimes against Asian Americans. And you have the President of the United States calling COVID-19 Kung flu and Wuhan virus, that type of thing.
Right.
I have a colleague, Russell Jung at San Francisco State University, who's created a website to document the rise of Asian American hate crimes, hate crimes committed against Asian Americans. People who know Asian American history know that this is not unique. It's actually historical. So if you go back to the way the Chinese, for instance, especially, but not uniquely in California, were treated, post-gold rush, the Chinatowns were seen as these gross and disgusting bastions of, where disease was rampant and prostitution and opium dens, that type of thing. So the linkage between Asian Americans as carriers of disease has some sort of history. So that's one thing. With Black Lives Matter, one thing that I've been so heartened to see, and here, because I'm a Southern California resident, I have live memories of the LA riots, right. In 1992. And in 1992, the Korean American community was caught between African American protesters and the mostly white police force that decided not really to protect Koreatown, right? So I'm simplifying a complex history, and I hope you and the audience forgives me here. But Korean Americans, there was a lot of destruction of property, right? In the most recent couple of weeks, it's been K-pop fans. I think they're called K-pop stans, stalker and fan. I guess that's what the kids are calling these days, that have been doing incredible organizing work, number one, against the current president's rallies, and also mobilizing other young Asian Americans to stand in solidarity with the African American community and other Black and brown folk. So there is a history of Asian Americans being seen as the middle minority, not just the model minority, but the middle minority between Black and white. I think there's been some chatter about the wife of the officer who killed George Floyd being Asian American. So there's some history of that. So there's some sensitivity that Asian American communities have in BLM protests. And yet, for the most part, I'm so happy to see the rise of Asian American solidarity with BLM.
Right. I mean, and you're definitely part of that world of new scholarship and helping us to see things, in a different way. And I'm really grateful. I do think of you as being kind of on the front lines of things with your students. And there's so many times that I run across your former students, and they're so impressed with you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Malcolm, let me say one more thing. The other thing I should say is that while I'm talking about Asian American activism now and comparing it to 1992, I don't want you or others to get the impression that Asian American activism is new. So for instance, I've done, as have other people, I've done some work on Yuri Kochiyama.
Oh, right.
Who is, well-known civil rights, radical activist.
We stayed at her house. She's our...
Great.
Whenever we were in Harlem, we would stay with that Auntie Yuri.
Yes, I mean, right. I mean, so,
she held Malcolm X when he was dying.
There you go. And so she was integral in the movement for reparations for Japanese Americans. But what people don't always know is that she learned of the very concept of reparations from the African American struggle for reparations. And she herself credits Malcolm X as being her North Star, as someone who taught her third world consciousness, right? So she would be one of many people, right, that I could lift up as examples, right? So it's not a new thing. It's not 2020, right? It's 1960s and even beforehand.
Right? I love that, because she just means so much to me personally, and just, she had such a huge heart, and she did. I mean, just shows that one person can just make such an enormous difference.
Yes,
you really put your life on the line, and when you have that kind of heart.
Absolutely.
It's funny because we're talking about her and her life. I do think a little bit about the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about that. Like, where do our understanding of human rights come from? And, how did that document come about? And just kind of like, how is that way of looking at the world doing these days? I mean, it's so central to the thesis of your book.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So, I can give you certain points of origin, but all of these points of origin are themselves contested. So I can point to so for instance, the concept of human rights is in the UN Charter, but there is no catalog of human rights. The catalog does not come until what you just named, the 1948 Universal Declaration. So then the question becomes, well, does that mean the founders of the UN invented the idea, or where did that idea come from? And there's one trajectory of thought that I'm sympathetic to. It's not the only source, but it's to draw a continuous line between natural law thinking to natural rights to human rights. But that would be in the Western tradition. Now, if you say that, that would be one way of saying the West, or what, I shouldn't treat the West as a monolith, but there's a political theory line that you can draw, right? But you could also draw this line in other religious and cultural traditions. So the Quran talks about there being no compulsion in religion, right? And you can have examples of religious tolerance in India under the Emperor Ashoka or whatever, right? So there's the concept of human rights, entitlements to certain kinds of treatment or forbearance thereof that every human being has by virtue of being human. So these are not earned. They are not dependent on social status. So there's the concept of human rights. And then there's the certain catalog of provisions. And the catalog of provisions, we can give certain historical dates. Okay, 1948, there was a specification. And then in the 1960s, there was further specification and further covenants. And now we're talking about environmental rights and we can further specify. But usually when people talk about where does the idea come from, sometimes by that they mean the very idea of simply by being human, you should be treated in a certain way and not treated a certain way. And then the question comes, well, how and when did people think that? Surely slavery was a near universal institution in antiquity. So clearly people did not have the idea of simply because you're human, you should not be enslaved, right? So the idea it had a history, right? It had to develop.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, your book too is an interesting one too. Is like, so how do we talk about a basis for like why, I mean, if you're in a repressive regime, it would be easy to make the argument that, human rights, that's a European thing. And it's another form of colonialism. Like how do you respond to that kind of argument? And then, how do you, it's part of the thesis of your book. So I don't know, maybe the best thing to do is either describe your book's thesis or just answer that one.
So I'll describe that. there tends to be two types of people who say human rights are a modern Western idea, if the point is then to say we should disregard them.
Right.
So one type of person is the authoritarian dictator, right, who does not want to grant what we would call democratic rights, or rights to participate in the basic governance of society. Okay. And then the response to that is, have you asked the people what they want? And have you asked the people what they believe? And don't forget that if we're talking about human rights to food, or human rights to clean air, human rights to safety, it's hard to see how food is a modern Western desire and not anything else, right? So usually when people make those complaints about modern Western idea, they're particularly going after freedom of expression or so-called democratic rights.
Or gender rights.
Yeah, gender, LGBTQIA, that type of thing, right? Yeah. The second category of people who say that are academic elites, and maybe they want to they want to give an origin story, like the one I just named even. Sometimes the critique is not human rights are modern Western, but human rights are uniquely Christian. And unless you espouse the idea that God has created human beings, human beings are created in the image of God, and that's the only basis for universal human dignity, then your concept of human rights is anemic. It does not have any substantial flooring. So there are iterations of the idea of human rights is provincial or partial. And I've given you a couple of them. And in my book, I try to do what I can to interrogate those very provincial claims.
Right. I love that part of it. Just like the people who base their ethic on a religious claim, versus people who don't. And just trying to find a kind of a mediating position between those two places.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a tricky thing, and at this point, I tend to think that. Of course, I don't mean to discredit my own work. I only mean to say that the book really is trying to give a meta-ethical account of the idea of human rights and whether we can justify them, right? Given our pluralistic understanding of the good.
Yeah.
I think the urgent question people have today is not about justification of human rights or grounding human rights. I think people just want them, right? They want to see them realized. They want clean air. They want potable water. They want an end. They want vaccines to cure preventable diseases, right? People want the stuff. And whether you call them human rights, for some people, whether you call them human rights or you call them human goods or is not the question. So this is all to say that, of course, as an academic, I do the scholarly things and I like it. And I don't think my book answers the most urgent human rights questions today.
Yeah, I was completely had a bunch of questions about that in terms of just like how your thinking has developed since then, just how the project looks to you now that you look back on it. But I mean, in a way, Black Lives Matter again that's another thing. It's just like, I don't know. I don't know if the president is saying that Black people don't have rights or that the rights aren't important. Yeah. They're saying things like all lives matter.
That's right.
In a way that diminishes like the African-American experience in the United States and diminishes the suffering that African-American people are experiencing.
That's right.
But I mean, at different moments there's going to be a kind of a different way of looking. I mean, it's just like we're completely progressing all the time. It's just like we'll never have just the situation that we had in January. We'll never have the situation that we have right now. I mean, things are changing, and I do think there's something to be said for your project, which says that these rights are really central. Like we have to treat them as if we've discovered human rights rather than as if we're manufacturing them or inventing them. You know what I mean? That's really what's at the basis of this. It's not like rights aren't something conferred on somebody, but there's something that we discover that is part of the universe in the same way that 2 and 3 is 5, you know?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Of course, I could say a lot to the all lives matter. I'm sure you've come up with your very, again, back to the youth will save us. This are they called Zoomers now? The youngest generation?
I don't even know. They're great though. I love them.
Yeah, incredible memes coming out about on Father's Day. You shouldn't give your dad a Father's Day card because all fathers matter. Like
people matter.
Yeah, exactly. On July 4th, all countries matter. On your birthday. Just trying to show the absurdity of because it's not a good retort, right?
And we just have different ways of talking about things too they're constantly. Again, it's just like when I talk to young people, they're just so much more savage about how to talk about LGBTQ plus issues, about gender issues, about identity issues, about ethnicity, about intermarriage, all those things. I mean, there is a way in which, just in the same way that I think that racism is evolving, mass incarceration is an example of a nascent racism, that, a new expression of racism, if you will, in our time. But the language for understanding and identifying it is also evolving. And I think that's really, it's an interesting thing. It's funny. I wonder if you feel like this, but I do, that, the current presidential administration has just made me a lot more conscious. I think about human rights and human rights violations a lot more than I did like 5 years ago. And I wonder if you can reflect or imagine or consider, what are the lasting effects on human rights going to be, of this presidential administration as you see it?
That's a really good question. So there have been concerns about. Okay, so the question is, what are the lasting effects of human rights for this administration? Well, of course, we were all celebrating the recent Supreme Court case about, now by federal law, if you're right, exactly. And so there was some concern that what this administration was trying to do in terms of rolling back transgender rights, LGBT rights, that was a victory for the progressives and not for the current administration.
A lot of it may have to do with immigration. Well, there's also probably discourse elements too. Just like, to have the president speak in such dismissive and derogatory way.
I was going to go there. That's right. That it's because the type of, if you have children still in cages, separated from their families of origin, that is psychic and psychological trauma, putting aside the physical, which, and you're hearing of sexual abuse about these unaccompanied minor and detained ones. That is long-term, right? That's a very, very big one. I think, but my answer would be closer to yours, beyond the immigration point and the LGBT thing that I led with. I do worry about the normalization and the, the encouragement or the excitement of what I thought were fringe elements of American society. It's not that I thought they were gone, right? But I thought they were very, very fringe. Here I'm talking about white nationalism and white supremacy.
Really. White supremacist rallies happening in places like, everywhere.
Literally Nazis in Charlottesville, right? That type of thing. In the last 2 weeks, there are literally nooses, right, on trees, in some cases accompanied by Black bodies, right? So I think it's rather than talking about the administration's specific policies, which is one thing, and I don't want to discount that, it's the larger culture an incitement of the types of things in society that I thought, again, was in the shadows, but has clearly been being brought out front and center. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to bumble my way through a response. Yeah.
No, I don't know what to make of it either. I mean, I just in the same way that during the Iraq War,
Yes.
use of, I just never thought I'd live in a country that tortured people. And,
Right.
I mean, and so yeah, I mean, and the Bush administration's legacy is torture in part. I mean, I'm not saying that's the only thing that happened, but I mean, maybe it showed something to us that was always true about us, or maybe we crossed a line. But anyway, that's what I was thinking. And you must think about stuff.
No, that's a good point. And actually, that makes me think. I think the other two things I would say is that this president has really encouraged distrust of the mainstream media, of experts, of journalists. I mean, that's very, very frightening. And democracies don't work, right? If people, right? I mean, that just journalists jailed even, right?
Yeah.
So that's one major concern. And then, every person who came up through public school, I mean, any person who knows American civics, three branches of government, co-equal, checks and balances, right? And you're seeing this administration not really following convention, defying judicial orders, so I think, again, this is not my area of specialties in terms of political theory in American government, but I do worry about the implications, the long-term implications of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think you can break things and not be able to put them back together again.
Yes,
So,
yeah.
And there's again, it's just a little bit like the torture in the sense that, these problems that Americans in their ignorance may have just attributed, those are things that happened somewhere else.
Yes.
It does make you realize or reminds you that
that's right.
It's a tough one for sure. I also think about just the environment too, just like, so, when you roll back those environmental protections, what that means in terms of environmental justice. So just the health of poor communities of color, will be affected, and that someone getting cancer or having cancer, has an enormous effect on when you have increased those rates in particular communities in terms of disabling them and removing their voice or making it impossible for them to participate, et cetera. So that's definitely part of it.
To that point, and this is not to be taken as a defense of the current administration, but it's clear that our environmental crisis predates, of course, this current administration.
Right, exactly.
Right? This is and the fault lines and the responsibility are across political parties, businesses, individual consumer habits. A lot more can be said about this topic, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that was most haunting to me about your book was when I was reading it, it was during COVID-19, and you were describing some women in just very repressive societies where, they're not allowed to participate in public life. They're not allowed to go in public, or when they go up in public, they have to be covered. And, in America, these are temporary restrictions that are ultimately going to be, but for women in those situations, that's their permanent reality. It's like COVID-19 all the time for them. And I wonder just, what you see in terms of just like the situation of women around the world. I mean, you're part of conferences and, groups of scholars that are doing work on women's liberation around the world. And just, how are things going just in that area of ethics?
Yeah, so I am a proponent of reproductive justice. So there are, some would say 3 or 4 key human rights attached to that. So one is everyone's right to have a child or to not have a child. To not have a child is linked to the right to have an abortion or to terminate pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
And around the world, we are seeing, especially with this administration's, back to your question, defunding, right? And it's not just this administration, but the Republican Party wanting to not have monies directed toward, what am I trying to say?
Health, basically.
Yeah, exactly. If there's women's health or family health, and yet if they perform abortion services, they are not given the funding, and so there are collateral effects to that. Meaning, the various human rights councils have seen the link between unsafe abortion and maternal morbidity or death or other health problems. So that's a big one, right? That said, when you look at what women want, so of course, obviously I went women, reproduction, abortion, right? But I don't only want to give that sense, right? That it's women, reproduction, it's also education. It's also freedom of movement. It's equity and in hiring. In one country, it might be the right to drive. In another country, it might be. But then again, it was only under Obama that women in this country, the U.S., had equal pay for equal work, a protection for that. That's the Lilly Ledbetter Act, right? Obama's first piece of legislation he signed into law. And so this is not to, I would hate for people to get the sense that women's problems are outside of the U.S., not in the U.S. In the U.S., we still have problems with intimate partner violence, which of course also affects men, but disproportionately women. Right now, we're still in the Me Too, not at the height of it.
Right.
And so, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are some women's issues that are universal, right? And reproductive and care and women's health tends to be one of them. And there are some that are regional because there are regional disputes. And there are some things that women want that any human being wants, which is, again, back to enough calories to sustain themselves, clean air, a safe environment, education, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I loved Martha Nussbaum's comparative approach, that list of, signs of human flourishing as, my shorthand for it. But I mean, in a way, I like too that there's a function for having a rights approach to things, and there's also a place for that too, to talk about human flourishing that's beyond just like meeting the minimum needs in terms of safety and et cetera.
Yeah, that's right. So Martha Nussbaum, as you know, is this well-known feminist philosopher. Has a list of 10, she calls them 10 central human capabilities. And they're inspired by Aristotle's notion that it means something. Every type of creature has a way it flourishes. So what a raccoon needs to flourish is different than what a human being needs to flourish, right? And so she has these 10 central capabilities. And what she does in her work is she tries to say, and these capabilities should be the standard by which governments measure themselves. So the problem, and she see the capabilities are not to be in competition with human rights. The problem with rights language is that sometimes it can just be purely legalistic. So you could say, oh, LGBT folks have the right to XYZ. Because now we can point to a law that says XYZ. But her point about capabilities is that if you cannot actually realize that right, if your experience of life is such that it is not even if you have the legal right to X, you cannot actually do X because you don't have enough resources, or because your local government is inept, then there's a sense in which we can't really say you have the right. So I too, as you know, I'm a big fan of her work.
Yeah, me too.
And especially because her list of 10 central capabilities was developed and refined over time by talking especially, but not exclusively, to women all across the world, especially India. Right.
Yeah. I remember her work with Amartya Sen,
Yes.
especially on India. Yeah, it was, Grace, we have a tradition on the forum, and that is that we take questions from our audience.
Okay.
So I'd love to encourage, and they're usually the best questions.
Okay.
They're so good. So I'd like to encourage everybody to send your question in through the comments to Rebecca, and Rebecca will text the comments to me. She already is doing that right now. So the first question we have from the audience is, could you talk about the ethics of reparations for descendants of enslaved people, expanding on your mention of reparations for Japanese Americans after World War II? Okay. What's the best way forward on this issue?
Okay. So the ethics of it, reparations can be thought of in a moral way and a legal way. And actually there is emerging it's not law per se, but there are some, there's one key human rights resolution talking about reparations, not specifically in the African-American case, but in countries where there have been heinous crimes committed, what would have to happen? In the American case, people usually have a very narrow understanding of reparations. They think of it solely in terms of money. But reparations from let's say a human rights standpoint can mean public apology. It can include that. It could mean compensation. It could mean restitution. It could be the erecting of historical memorials. It could mean a public education fund to educate the masses about the crimes committed, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the law. The moral case in the US is pretty clear. You have enslaved a group of people, you've kidnapped them, you've enslaved them, you've deprived them of wages, because that is what slavery is, the institution is. And then, as we all know, there's lasting legacies of that. There are lots of well-known objections to it. Well, let's take my family. My parents immigrated when I was born, so that's in the 1970s. And maybe, I'm not saying my parents are like this, but my hypothetical parents would say, well, I didn't participate. I never owned slaves, so there are all sorts of objections to that. And it would take me a long time to go through them one by one. But just a good overall rejoinder is to say, in the same way that I inherit the good things in the country, the blessings, I drive on roads that were cleared, by whatever, then I should have a share in the nation's burdens as well, right? So you can't just take the good with the bad is the colloquial way of saying it. And sorry, I'm being very long-winded, but the point, the historical point is only to say that Yuri Kuchiyama was a member of the Republic of New Africa, and they had a call for reparations and a referendum also for African Americans to decide, do you want to be a member of the US or do you want to join this new thing? And then they had a call for 5 southern states and a certain amount of dollars to be returned, right? So it's a historical piece. And I was just making the point that Yuri Kochiyama, herself a big proponent of Japanese American reparations, was someone who learned of the very concept through her work with Malcolm X and RNA.
Yeah, what an extraordinary person. Another question from the audience is, could you say more about the Me Too movement? So they would want to hear more about your take on that.
Okay, my take. So the Me Too movement was started by Tarana Burke and then popularized by, I think, the actress Alyssa Milano. And the idea was to publicize the fact that the problem of sexual assault or sexual harassment was so more widespread. It wasn't just the minority of people courageous enough to have outed themselves, but it was so many people. I think the current rates are something like 1 in 3 women, right, in the United States. Different rates elsewhere. What ended up happening is that industry by industry, there were, again, not exclusively, but mostly women who banded together and said, and that guy did it to me, and that guy did it to me, and that guy too. And one by one, they were taken down. What's interesting is that I think we are now on the cusp of a racism Me Too, where one by one, people are saying, and that well-known, usually white celebrity or white person in power, he or she did this to me. Oh, me too, me too, me too. And we're starting to see some repercussions of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's never a way to publish everything. I mean, there were gatekeepers to kind of keep up. And so, I mean, there's a way in which the technology has changed our
Yes,
setting. And I wonder if there's other ways in which that has a kind of like ethical elements to it, or if it's something that you think very much about. I mean, the internet means that we all can be publishers. We can all publish, in a way that just wasn't possible in 1992.
That's right. That's right. I mean, so, and as you know, Malcolm, there are scholars who do this very thing. They talk about the link between technology and social movement. So you've got Arab Spring, and you right, being attributed to with Twitter, and Hong Kong protesters with the umbrella movement being able to coordinate. Oh, here's where the police are. Don't go there. Go this other place. I mean, it's wild. Again, back to it's the youth who will save us. Because these folks are far more creative than I ever could be.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have definitely, because being in Silicon Valley, talking to people who are the technologists about what's coming up in the future, I'm very sensitive to just the connection between how technology changes culture,
Yes.
makes some kinds of democratic expressions more possible, and makes more repression in other ways possible.
Yes, absolutely.
This may be a question that's just too hot to handle, and you can always just defer if you don't want to talk about it.
Okay.
But you and I talked a lot about, after Virginia Tech, we talked. You and I had a few conversations about gun violence, in the wake of that. And I wondered if that was kind of part of what you're paying attention to these days, or if you have any insight in terms of sharing what you think of the possibilities. Because I guess that's another thing that the Trump administration just Trump keeps saying things about the Second Amendment, and it seems pretty difficult to make progress on gun violence in these days. And I just wonder what signs of hope do you see, or what insight you might have to share with us about it.
Yeah. So. The reference here for your audience is that I was faculty at Virginia Tech for 6 years, and from 2003 to 2009. And thus I lived through the shootings that claimed 33 lives. So I should put on the record that I'm a pacifist. I'm a Christian pacifist. There are pacifists who support the police function, and there are those who don't. Just putting it all out there. Yeah. So it's clear to me that that we need reasonable gun control, and the hope that if I see any hope these days, it's with recent calls to defund the police. Now, in saying that tagline, different people mean different things. So when I say I see hope in defunding the police, I mean that section of folk who say, look, it's better to send a trained social worker to deal with someone who is homeless, or maybe acting a little mentally unstable, or whatever, than a police officer with a gun, right, to deal with that situation. And that in that sense, that does give me hope, because again, I don't have the statistics behind me, but the perception is one of the reasons why these minor traffic violations, result in officer-involved shootings. It's not just the racism. Of course, racism is a huge part, but it's the fear that the person on the other side is armed. And in this country, when you have a very active NRA and you've got the Second Amendment, you have a lot of people packing heat, maybe it is a reasonable assumption. Again, I don't know the rates of gun ownership. So I'm not current on policy, but I would love for there to be social services and interventions of various kinds, not involving the militarized police, right? If that's a kind of sideways response to your question.
No, that's very helpful. I wonder how it looks different to you too, like from when it happened to now. I mean, sometimes something will come up and there'll be a shooting, and I'll just think, oh my gosh, poor Grace, because you're watching the same news that I'm watching, and
right.
So I really do think of you because you're so close to that whole thing. And I saw you not very long after that.
Yeah.
But I just wonder, does something happen? You're just like, oh, not again. I mean,
Yeah, that's right. So that was 2007. And there have been a whole series of other mass shootings, some with higher body counts, some with lower body counts. So at different times, I have been kind of like, I can't see live camera feed of bodies, and, I can't. And other times, in fact, I think I just read, I wish I had the source. And this was for the month of March and April. I don't know about June, but they were saying it's the first time in X number of years where there weren't school shootings. And again, the reason there weren't school shootings is because school wasn't in session. And it was the sense that, oh my God, you have to literally not have school in order for there not to be a school shooting, right? Yeah.
Here's another question that we have from the audience. Can you speak more about Asian American social justice as a continuation of the civil rights movement? I have a Korean colleague who shared with me that the rise in crimes against Asians and making him challenged to sit with the seesawing emotions of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter with his personal experience of social bullying that he has experienced in the streets of LA. So Asian American social justice as part of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, so we use the term civil rights movement, but there are different historical moments within that. And the so-called, what we now call the Asian American movement, happened a little bit later, late 1960s, early 1970s. And that coincided with the rise of ethnic studies on various college campuses. And that was a time where various Asian ethnicities realized there was something to be had in forging a common community or forging solidarity with one another. So even if outsiders can't always distinguish someone Korean from Japanese or Chinese or Vietnamese or whatever, and they may treat all Asians as the same, Asians themselves may have historical animosities and countries of origin who are still, not really getting along, right? Yeah. But Asians in America realized there was some good to be had to fight a common enemy, right? Which was systemic racism. So for instance, when Japanese Americans were interred, there were some Chinese and Koreans who wore buttons that said, I am Chinese, I am Korean, as in, I'm not a bad Asian, I'm one of the good ones. Yeah. So that would be 1940s consciousness. Right. And in the 1960s and 70s, the idea was, no, we should not accept this divide and conquer mentality. We should come together and work together and build an alliance.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. One of the things that you mentioned in your book, when you're talking about human rights, it kind of leads naturally to questions about animal rights.
Yes.
And I just wonder, what's going on in the ethics of animal rights, and what do you see coming up in the future on that?
So I love this question because I actually teach a class. It's one of my more popular classes. It's called Animal Theology and Animal Rights. And I study a number of people who think the turn to the animal is similar to the turn to women, meaning once upon a time, you could be a totally well-regarded, well-respected scholar and not talk about women, in fact, be anti-feminist or misogynistic.
Right.
And now today, we would say that's ridiculous, right? And increasingly, I've seen in what we call human animal studies or animal studies, more and more serious scholars in multiple disciplines take up the question of the animal. And the relationship between human rights and animal rights is one of, well, what makes humans so special? And so someone like Peter Singer, who's a well-known utilitarian who's at Princeton, will say it's actually speciesist to treat human beings as categorically different than non-human animals because it's morally arbitrary. He says it's morally arbitrary in the same way that a racist treats white as better than black or men as better than women. So the charge of speciesism in philosophy or philosophical ethics can sometimes link up to the charge of anthropocentrism against, let's say, Christianity. And then philosophers and theologians have to think, well, is my tradition anthropocentric or speciesist, or can I give morally justifiable reasons to treat humans differently than animals differently? Now, what's happening is all sorts of interesting cases. So there's something called the Great Apes Project, where Jane Goodall and other people are trying to say it is not okay to lock up in cages the great apes because they are we should treat them like persons. And person, of course, is a philosophical category distinguishable from humans, and there's a lot more I can say to that. I just as you said before about the youth being environmental and savvy, I see the youth being very, very concerned about the treatment of animals, which of course is linked to the environment.
Yeah, there at the USF Law School, they just appointed a new animal law faculty member.
Yes, that's right.
And I heard a little bit of his just like beginning like lecture, but I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what he's up to. We're completely running out of time, and but I don't want to miss this. But what kind of things are you working on now? What kind of projects do you have coming for us to look forward to seeing from you in the future?
Okay.
I'm excited about the animal theology class, by the way. I want to take that.
Okay. I'll send you my syllabus. So I'm working on 2 books. One is one volume book, follow-up, I should say, to Asian American Christian Ethics. That was an anthology with a bunch of authors, and this is a 1-volume intro to this subfield that my colleagues and I kind of inaugurated a couple of years ago.
Congratulations.
So that's one. Thank you. The other is a book I'm writing on surrogacy. I myself am a former surrogate, had a child for a friend, and then as an ethicist, I'm talking about surrogacy. Surrogacy is interesting because it has divided the feminist and Christian community. That there are, and it's not even a right versus left thing. That people are uneasy about it, and they're also celebratory about it. So I'm talking about my personal experiences, and I'm also looking at it from a feminist and Christian standpoint.
Oh, that's wonderful! I can't wait to read them. And I know, just based on grounding human rights in a pluralistic world, that just like the clarity and the organization will be excellent.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you so much for taking time to be with us and to talk about how the world is looking to you. I mean, our conversation would have been so different if it had been a month ago or 2 months ago. And
absolutely,
I'm so grateful for your thoughtfulness and that you're really out there on the front line doing this important work.
Thank you, Malcolm.
This is going to be the last forum in our online spring series. Please join us on June 27th for a service commemorating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and on July 7th for a service to celebrate and reflect on the themes of AIDS 2020, the world's largest annual conference on HIV/AIDS. You can help us bring the arts to life at Grace Cathedral with a gift today to the forum. Please visit gracecathedral.org/give to Grace. And thanks again to Grace Kao for joining me tonight. Thanks for everybody who was able to be here. God bless you all and take care. And we'll see you when we can see you all in person. Good night.